And all he thought about was getting the other children safe. In my book, he's a hero, and he will always be a hero.
Chaos and panic at a Nevada middle school after a student opened fire, and tonight a math teacher who lost his life in the shooting is being called a hero for putting his life on the line, trying to protect children who were in the line of fire.
They looked like ordinary kids, some with baby faces, others in school uniforms, still clutching onto the last fragments of their childhood. But behind those innocent appearances were dark, deliberate decisions that led to bloodshed, betrayal, and life sentences. This isn't about mistakes. These teenage boys didn't just snap. They planned, they stalked, they killed. One murdered his entire family, then sat calmly at the dinner table as if nothing happened. Another stabbed a classmate over 40 times just to feel what it was like to take a life. And one of them whispered to police after gunning down his friends in a school hallway, "Kill me. I can't believe I did that." But they did do it. And the justice system had to ask, should a teenager spend the rest of his life behind bars? Can someone so young be truly evil, or just broken beyond repair? In this video, we uncover the most disturbing cases of teenage boys sentenced to die in prison. You'll hear their shocking confessions, final courtroom statements, and the haunting details that judges, jurors, and even seasoned investigators could never forget. Because once you look into the eyes of these boys, you'll wonder if evil has an age, or if it simply learns to hide better in youth. Case 1. Jose Reyes.
We're both 12 years old. One was shot through the shoulder, the other shot in the abdomen.
To face with him? Did he say anything to you? He just shot you. How far away from you was he?
About 10, 20 feet.
And did you realize right away that you had been shot? Did you know? You knew it.
On the morning of October 21st, 2013, the calm routine at Sparks Middle School in Nevada was shattered by an act of violence that no one could have foreseen. At least, not without looking deeper into the quiet pain of a 12-year-old boy named Jose Reyes. Just after 7 a.m., Reyes arrived at the school carrying a 9mm semi-automatic handgun. Within minutes, he had fatally shot 45-year-old teacher and former Marine Michael Lansbury, wounded 2 of his fellow students, and then turned the weapon on himself. The tragedy unfolded so quickly, but the questions it raised still echo through classrooms, courtrooms, and national conversations about youth violence. What followed was a deeply complex investigation, not just into the logistics of how a middle schooler obtained a firearm, but into the psychological state of a child who had carefully planned this attack. Law enforcement recovered Reyes's personal notebook and electronic search history, revealing a disturbing pattern. He had watched videos about the Columbine shooters, researched top 10 evil children, and consumed violent online content. His actions were not random, nor were they impulsive. Authorities determined that Jose was suffering from severe mental and emotional distress. He had reportedly been prescribed Prozac and antipsychotics and was believed to be battling depression, social isolation, and possibly early signs of developmental disorders. Michael Lansbury's final moments were acts of selfless courage. When the gunfire began, he stepped forward to protect the students, telling them to run to safety. Witnesses later said he calmly tried to de-escalate the situation, urging Jose to drop the weapon. His death, while tragic, likely prevented a far greater massacre. He became a symbol of heroism in the face of horror, and his name is now etched into school memorials and national remembrance. His actions served as a pivot point in the investigation, in legal reform discussions, and in how school safety is addressed at both local and federal levels. As police secured the scene and began piecing together what had happened, the Reyes family, who owned a small local restaurant, were plunged into disbelief. They released a statement expressing sorrow for all involved and claimed that their son had shown no outward signs of such violent intent. But private notes found in Jose's belongings painted a darker picture. In one, he blamed bullying for his emotional state. In another, he insisted that neither bullying nor violent video games were to blame. It was a contradiction that complicated any singular explanation for what drove him. Law enforcement had no opportunity to interrogate or put him on trial, as Reyes died at the scene. Instead, the justice system was left to draw conclusions from evidence, witness reports, and forensic psychology. What emerged from the case was a broader discussion about the vulnerability of children, the signs of psychological distress that often go unnoticed, and the responsibilities of parents, schools, and institutions in detecting early threats. Although Jose was just 12 years old, he had access to a deadly weapon, one that was reportedly stored in a manner that violated safety protocols. This became a focal point in public debates about gun storage laws and parental accountability. Prosecutors did not pursue criminal charges against his parents, but the court of public opinion wrestled with their role. The Washoe County School District responded by implementing increased mental health support services, while Nevada lawmakers reviewed and adjusted policies around school safety and youth access to firearms. Sparks Police issued a full report urging reforms on how threats are evaluated, how mental health crises are reported, and how families can be supported when early signs of violence appear. Active shooter protocols were revised, and trauma counseling was deployed throughout the district. A year after the shooting, students and staff returned to a school that was forever changed, not just physically, but emotionally. This wasn't the story of a villain. It was the story of a child in crisis. And while Jose Reyes didn't face a courtroom, the case created ripples across the legal system. School boards, mental health advocates, and gun reform organizations pointed to the Sparks Middle School shooting as a wake-up call. The lack of a traditional sentencing hearing didn't stop legal scholars from evaluating the implications. Should schools be required to perform deeper psychological screenings? Are parents legally liable for what their children do with unsecured weapons? How early is too early to identify violent ideation? Beyond the investigation and policy changes, the emotional fallout remained heaviest among the survivors. One of the wounded students later said he remembered the way Reyes looked, not enraged, but almost vacant, as if the event had been rehearsed in his mind long before it happened. This haunting detail furthered discussions among psychiatrists about juvenile cognitive development and the line between mental illness and premeditated violence. In the years since, the name Jose Reyes has faded from headlines, but his case continues to surface in academic research, in legislative hearings, and in every conversation that begins with, "How did we not see this coming?" It's a story that forces reflection not just on the final moments of a tragic day, but on all the moments that came before, when help might have made a difference. The shooting at Sparks Middle School left one teacher dead, 2 students wounded, and a community shaken. But it also left behind a series of painful but necessary lessons about mental health, bullying, firearm access, and institutional blind spots. The takeaway is sobering. The age of a killer does not diminish the impact of their crime, but it can amplify the responsibility of those around them to act before it's too late. Case 2. Nicholas Browning. On a frigid night in Cockeysville, Maryland on February 1, 2008, a respected suburban home turned into the scene of a grotesque betrayal. Inside the Browning household, Nicholas Wagoner Browning, a 15-year-old honor student, Boy Scout, and varsity athlete, carefully retrieved his father's 9mm handgun. In the quiet early hours, he walked through the house and shot his father, mother, and younger brothers as they slept. Neighbors described the Browning family as the picture of normalcy. A professional attorney father, a devoted stay-at-home mother, and 3 sons who liked lacrosse, golf, and family trips to Deep Creek Lake. No one expected the eldest son, nicknamed Nick, to turn on the very people who raised him. Nicholas later admitted what he had done. He returned to his friend's house, played video games, and posed as though nothing had happened. The next day, he asked to be dropped off at home. Once inside, he calmly told his friend's father that something seemed wrong. Moments later, he dialed 911 and confessed to having killed his family. Police arrested him 2 days later and charged him with 4 counts of first-degree murder. Despite being a minor, he was tried as an adult and denied bail. From the outset, investigators grappled with the question of psyche. Was this a moment of rage or a calculated act? Defense attorneys argued Nicholas suffered abuse at home, even presenting evidence of verbal and physical violence by his father, John Browning. A forensic psychiatrist testified that Nicholas may have been in a dissociative trance during the killings, his mind detached from the horror unfolding around him. Meanwhile, prosecutors painted a very different psychological profile. A privileged teenager who resented authority, wanted control, and did not want to share an inheritance. They also noted he was known to bully and dominate his younger brother. Proof, they said, that his actions were selfish and premeditated. When Nicholas pleaded guilty in early 2009, the courtroom confrontation was chilling in its restraint. He wept quietly while listening to prosecutors detail the crime. At sentencing, he told the judge, "Words can't adequately describe what I did," and confessed he would give his own life to take it all back. The judge imposed 4 life sentences, 2 consecutive, ensuring he would never see release under standard terms. Yet due to the plea deal, eligibility for parole after decades was possible under Maryland law. The case rippled outward, sparking broad discussions about juvenile justice and rehabilitation. Maryland lawmakers and public advocates argued that young offenders should not be sentenced the same way as adults. A bill passed years later prohibited mandatory life without parole for juveniles and allowed for resentencing after at least 20 years served. During debates, legislators referenced Browning's case, dividing opinion between redemption and proportional justice. Nicholas's grandparents testified at hearings and visited him in prison. Despite the horror, some felt compassion toward the boy they once knew. A complex reflection on family trauma, mercy, and reformed identity. In contrast, prosecutors insisted the brutality required permanent removal from society, citing the calculated nature of the crime and noting the deep emotional scars left on the community. Beyond legal proceedings, the case spotlighted several public safety takeaways. Families and educators debated how warning signs, anger, detachment, entitlement go unnoticed. Mental health experts emphasize that adolescent cognitive development can mask dissociation, impulsivity, and emotional dysregulation. If abused children are labeled only as troubled teens, the underlying trauma may go unaddressed until it erupts into violence. School administrators also reviewed security protocols and behavioral support systems. This case made it clear that community trust, while important, cannot substitute for proactive detection. Counseling services, peer intervention programs, and family counseling became connected to legal strategies alongside traditional punitive measures. Psychologically, Nicholas exemplifies a rarity, a teen whose outward success concealed internal collapse. He appeared normal to teachers and friends, but family histories of alcohol abuse, strict parenting, and unresolved resentment created a volatile environment. Even before the killings, classmates described him as a bully, someone who mocked minorities and the disabled. Afterward, that same popularity became part of the tragedy, not a facade, but a symptom of dissonant character. The justice system had few options. A sentencing hearing that normally weighs rehabilitation was replaced by a plea that skipped over juvenile rehabilitation programs. Nicholas's request for transfer to a youth offender program was denied. When he later petitioned for a reduced sentence, the judge ruled that the heinous nature of the crime rendered mercy unwarranted. That decision sealed his fate. He remains incarcerated with little hope of release unless policy changes allow revisiting his case in the decades ahead. Ultimately, the Browning family murders force us to reckon with uncomfortable truths. A boy can be both victim and perpetrator. Childhood does not always shield from darkness. While the community sought justice, the legal proceedings unveiled deeper questions. How early must mental health intervention occur? Should inheritance and teenage entitlement ever justify violence? Where is the line between discipline and dehumanization? That troubled night in Maryland didn't just end 4 lives. It began long conversations about juvenile justice, psychological crisis, and the limits of family loyalty. Each courtroom testimony, each psychiatric evaluation served as both evidence and warning. Rehabilitation was referenced, but never realized. Trial testimony showed remorse and manipulation. Legal proceedings culminated in life sentences, affirming society's need to condemn and protect. The investigation revealed nothing short of a calculated descent. Nicholas Browning remains behind bars, serving his sentence as Maryland's justice system grapples with redemption, responsibility, and whether a teenager can truly change after irrevocable violence. The case stands as a stark reminder. Even the most ordinary families can hide incipient tragedy. And the key to prevention lies not in punishment alone, but in early psychological awareness, open communication, and community vigilance. Case 3. Mitchell Johnson and Andrew Golden. On March 24, 1998, the quiet corridors of Westside Middle School in Jonesboro, Arkansas, filled with horror when 2 children unleashed violence that would shake the nation. That day, 13-year-old Mitchell Johnson and 11-year-old Andrew Golden pulled a fire alarm during 5th period. As students evacuated, the pair, armed with multiple rifles and pistols stolen from Golden's home, lay in wait just outside the building. When the doors opened, bullets rang out. 4 students and a teacher lost their lives, and 10 more were wounded before the shooters fled toward their waiting van, only to be arrested within minutes by responding officers. Investigators discovered a terrifying arsenal: 13 firearms, hundreds of rounds of ammunition, a crossbow, and camping gear packed into the stolen van. It was clear the attack had been meticulously planned. Johnson and Golden had deliberately missed their bus and recruited each other in what they later described as a revenge operation. Golden had set off the alarm seconds before running to join Johnson, who fired from a wooded clearing where he and Golden had positioned themselves to target the fleeing children. The victims, students aged 11 and 12, and 32-year-old teacher Shannon Wright, died instantly. Nearby, friends and school staff rushed to contain the scene amid chaos and grief. Authorities arrived within 10 minutes and detained the boys, ending the nightmare that had begun under a false fire drill. Psychological analysis of the 2 shooters revealed a disturbing dual dynamic. Golden, raised with firearms and described as aggressive, impulsive, and fascinated with violence, fit the profile of a dominating instigator. Johnson, traumatized and withdrawn, had endured abuse and was vulnerable to peer influence. A clinical psychologist compared Golden and Johnson to the Columbine shooters, one as the dominant psychopath, the other as a troubled follower. Golden reportedly warned classmates he had a lot of killing to do. When a counselor confronted him months earlier, Golden dismissed the warning as a nightmare. Johnson had mentioned mentally preparing for this fate to friends. In both cases, warning signs existed. No intervention occurred. Because their ages barred adult criminal trials in Arkansas at the time, both were adjudicated as juveniles. Their sentencing hinged not on moral culpability, but on legal limits. On his 14th birthday in August, shortly after pleading guilty to capital murder and assault charges, Johnson learned that both he and Golden would remain in custody until they turned 21, the maximum penalty under state juvenile law. Prosecutors noted they would have sought the death penalty had not age restrictions applied. Golden's lawyer argued he was mentally incompetent, but the jury convicted both, and they were sent to juvenile facilities for 7 and 9 years respectively. The fallout sparked national outrage. How could young children be held accountable yet released before true adulthood? That release proved consequential. Johnson walked free in August 2005, Golden in May 2007, their records sealed to protect their identities. In 2017, the victims' families were awarded $150 million in wrongful death litigation, reflecting the scale of loss and collective trauma. Golden, who had changed his name to Drew Grant, died in a fatal car crash in 2019. Johnson re-entered the system almost immediately. Arrested for unlawful firearm possession and drug offenses, he received prison terms totaling decades. At sentencing hearings, judges expressed frustration that rehabilitation had failed. They lamented Johnson had wasted the chance for reform. The legal proceedings that followed highlighted key issues: the limits of juvenile justice, the challenges of rehabilitation, and the complex reality of growing up inside a violent crime. Trial testimony had revealed remorse letters Johnson had written in detention, claiming he hoped people would one day know the real him. But his later behavior contradicted that claim. His repeated arrests for weapons and drug offenses illustrated the difficulty of reintegration. Golden's sealed files and name changes raised questions about society's ability to balance redemption with accountability. The community response was profound. Families of the slain established memorials, white ribbons on trees, a sundial engraved with names, and a park designed around the number 5 in tribute to the victims. Westside Middle School updated its security protocols and introduced behavioral support programs, recognizing that prevention requires structures as well as surveillance. Emotionally, survivors grappled with survivors' guilt and distrust. In interviews years later, some expressed conflicted feelings about Golden's death, not joy, but a painful reminder of what had been lost and how easily the system can fail vigilant care. This case offers broader criminal justice lessons. It demonstrates that when juveniles carry out calculated violence, legal systems built for minors struggle to hold them accountable or provide effective rehabilitation. It posed enduring questions about pediatric psychological assessment, trauma-informed schooling, and when society should treat youth as victims and when as perpetrators. It also showed that community awareness of mental health and peer influence can't simply rely on disciplines like punishment. They require proactive intervention. The psychological profile here was tragic and revealing. Golden, outwardly confident, fascinated by weapons, bordering on psychopathic traits. Johnson, inwardly damaged, a victim of childhood abuse, seeking acceptance through destructive mimicry. Together, they created a tragedy. The investigation revealed not only what happened, but what had been missed. Prior aggression, fascination with violence, explicit threats, and unheeded counselor warnings. Counselors had heard Golden talk of shooting classmates. Teachers noted Johnson's increasingly unmoored fantasy of belonging to street gangs. In the courtroom, trial testimony laid bare both grief and remorse. Johnson apologized, his head bowed, while Golden remained mostly silent. No sentencing hearing could bring back lives lost, and rehabilitation remained theoretical at best. As the men later exited juvenile institutions, it was clear public safety concerns lasted long after their release. Jonesboro's shooting remains historically significant. It was the deadliest middle school shooting before Columbine and served as a catalyst for school security reform nationwide. Policy experts cited the case in debates over juvenile sentencing, mental health support in schools, and access to firearms. The $150 million judgment awarded to victims' families served as both legal and moral condemnation of easy forgiveness. Ultimately, this story is a chilling example of how childhood admiration for violence, peer influence, systemic blindness, and legal limits converge to devastating effect. Golden and Johnson were children, but the violence was real, and the consequences far-reaching. It underscores the importance of early psychological intervention, rigorous criminal justice frameworks that adapt to youth offenders, and building school systems capable of detecting distress before tragedy strikes. Case 4. Philip Chism. In October 2013, a quiet hall at Danvers High School in Massachusetts became the site of one of the most disturbing crimes in recent memory. On October 22nd, 14-year-old Philip Chism followed his math teacher, 24-year-old Colleen Ritzer, into a school bathroom. Surveillance video captured him pacing the hallway before entering the girls' restroom with gloves and a hood, carrying a box cutter. What followed shattered trust, decency, and the naivete of a small community forever. Ritzer, outgoing and beloved by her students, had stayed after class to speak privately with Chism. She had asked him to share his thoughts, perhaps to help him settle into his new school, as he had recently relocated from Tennessee. Witness testimony described how Philip's demeanor changed in that moment, becoming visibly agitated before she abruptly ended the conversation and left him alone. Within minutes, Chism committed the unthinkable. Security video documented him exiting the bathroom with Ritzer's clothes in hand. Investigators later found her body in nearby woods after Philip stowed it in a recycling bin and attempted to conceal it under leaves. The murder was accompanied by a rape and robbery, charges on which he was also convicted. The investigation relied heavily on forensic evidence, hallway cameras, gloves, the box cutter, and eyewitness accounts, and allowed prosecutors to present a clear psychological profile of Philip. 2 forensic psychiatrists testified that, although he may have experienced mental strain, he acted with deliberation. He stalked Ritzer carefully, covered his face, changed clothing, and manipulated scenes, demonstrating awareness of wrongdoing. The defense pursued an insanity claim, arguing that Philip was in the throes of a psychotic episode, possibly hearing voices, and unable to control his behavior. A family history of mental illness was introduced in court. Yet Massachusetts law placed the burden of proof on the prosecution to prove sanity. The jury ultimately found Philip legally responsible, convincingly establishing that he knew right from wrong at the time of the crime. During the December 2015 legal proceedings, the jury returned verdicts of guilty on charges of first-degree murder, rape, and armed robbery. The rape charge that occurred after Ritzer's death in the woods was narrowly rejected. These verdicts showed jurors carefully weighed evidence rather than defaulting to emotion, despite the brutality of the offense. At the February 2016 sentencing hearing, Judge David Lowy described the slaying as brutal and senseless, and said, "The crashing waves of this tragedy will never wane." The judge imposed a life sentence for murder, concurrent 40-year terms for rape and robbery, but imposed these in a way that delayed parole eligibility until at least 2046, about 40 years after the crime, instead of the 25 years minimum that state guidelines often suggest for juvenile first-degree murder. The Ritzer family spoke passionately. Colleen's mother testified that Philip is pure evil and cannot be rehabilitated. She and her husband strongly opposed efforts to reduce mandatory sentences for juvenile offenders. Philip's later behavior behind bars added to the conviction that rehabilitation was unlikely. In 2024, he attacked a female youth services worker in a nearly identical manner, following her into a restroom and strangling her before being stopped. He pleaded guilty to attempted murder and received an additional 17 to 20-year sentence, served concurrently with his existing term. The case ignited complex discussion around juvenile justice reform, the interplay between youth mental health and criminal responsibility, and how legal systems should balance punishment with the potential for rehabilitation. In 2014, Massachusetts passed legislation banning life without parole for juveniles, requiring all such offenders to be eligible for release after 20 to 30 years. Yet Philip's combined sentencing structure effectively pushed his parole eligibility into middle age, fueling debate about proportional justice and legislative response to extreme crimes. The story of Philip Chism underscores a disturbing psychological lesson. Outward calm and academic success do not preclude inner turmoil or even predatory intent. He was described as a polite, tall teenager on the soccer team, yet his calculated move into violence revealed deep emotional disconnection. The investigation exposed layers of psychological disturbance, manipulation, and planning that belied typical adolescent cognition. Public safety takeaways include the urgent need for behavioral screening in schools, reporting of emotional changes, even subtle shifts in mood or social interaction, and coordination between educators and mental health professionals. The chilling actions of a student against a trusted teacher highlight the importance of vigilance, early intervention, and crisis preparedness in educational environments. The broader criminal justice reflection remains: how to deliver justice for victims while acknowledging the cognitive and emotional differences of juvenile offenders. Philip Chism's case continues to be studied in legal and academic circles, especially as he appeals to the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, claiming exclusion of mental illness evidence. To date, courts have upheld his convictions and denied requests for resentencing. In many ways, this tragic story reveals more questions than answers. At which point does a troubled youth become irreversibly dangerous? Can a system ever truly balance psychological nuance with accountability? The Daniel High horror served both as an investigation into a singular crime and as a cautionary reflection about preventive care, community responsibility, and the consequences when youth mental crises go untreated. Case 5. Zachary Davis. In the early evening of August 10, 2012, in Hendersonville, Tennessee, 15-year-old Zachary Everett Davis carried out an act so chilling it shattered his family forever. His mother, Melanie Davis, had fallen asleep after a movie outing with Zachary and his older brother Josh. Without warning, Zachary descended into the basement, retrieved a sledgehammer, and returned to her room. In what officials described as a methodical attack, he struck her repeatedly, then drenched the family's game room in whiskey and gasoline, setting it ablaze in a calculated attempt to kill his brother as well. Josh awoke to a fire alarm, escaped through smoke, and discovered the horrific scene. Zachary fled the house and was apprehended nearly 10 miles away, later telling investigators that he didn't feel anything when he killed his mother. The incident sent shockwaves through the community and quickly escalated into a wide-reaching criminal justice process. From the earliest stages, investigators and mental health professionals recognized that Zachary's mental state was central to understanding the crime. He had been diagnosed with schizophrenia and a depressive disorder. Following his father's death from ALS in 2007, he experienced profound emotional decline. Psychiatric records revealed he claimed to hear voices, including that of his deceased father, commanding him to kill. One forensic psychiatrist evaluated him at Vanderbilt Medical Center shortly after the tragedy and identified significant psychological disturbance that went unaddressed over the years. Despite these red flags, a Sumner County court ruled Zachary competent to stand trial following detailed behavioral and forensic evaluation. He was transferred from juvenile to criminal court, where a grand jury indicted him on charges of first-degree premeditated murder, attempted murder of his brother, and aggravated arson. At trial, prosecutors built a narrative of premeditation and awareness, surveillance of scenes, careful planning of escape, and deliberate ignition of fire. His behavior after the murder, wrapping the weapon, walking away calmly, was held up as evidence of calculated intent rather than impulsive rage. During legal proceedings, Zachary gave a videotaped confession, stating that he believed his mother wasn't taking care of my family, and chillingly recalled choosing a sledgehammer because I was worried that I'd miss, and it gave him the highest chance of killing her. When asked why he struck her multiple times, he reportedly replied, "I wanted to make sure she was dead." He laughed when describing the sound made by the impact. These chilling quotes were entered into trial testimony and used to undermine later attempts to portray him as mentally incapacitated during the act. Defense attorneys sought to raise the possibility of psychosis and trauma, including unverified claims of sexual abuse by his older brother, which Zachary presented as a motive. However, the jury was not persuaded that he lacked the capacity for premeditation or moral understanding at the time of the crime. They delivered guilty verdicts on all counts after just 3 hours of deliberation. The sentencing hearing followed, where the judge described the murder as brutal, senseless, and reflective of emotional disconnection. Zachary received a life sentence for his first-degree murder conviction, plus concurrent 20-year terms for the arson and attempted murder, resulting in multiple de facto life sentences. The sentencing structure made parole eligibility almost irrelevant, as the judge emphasized the need to protect the community from someone who was devoid of remorse, responsibility, and potential for rehabilitation. One of the most haunting aspects of the case was Zachary's affect during the trial. Measured, monotone, detached. He reacted calmly upon hearing recounts of his mother's death and never showed visible remorse. Judges and psychiatrists described him as capable of abstract thought, yet emotionally frozen, likening his demeanor to someone in a trance rather than an enraged teenager. This psychological dissonance drove national discussion. Was this the product of deep mental illness or an entirely unmoored adolescent devoid of empathy? The broader criminal justice implications went beyond the single sentencing. Zachary's case sparked debates over juvenile culpability, mental health accommodations in court, and how competency evaluations often shape plea decisions. While he was held legally accountable, critics argued that earlier intervention, more consistent psychiatric care, attention to grief after his father's death, behavioral changes at school, might have altered the outcome. His grandmother testified at trial that better mental health support could have prevented the tragedy altogether. In the aftermath, community and legal stakeholders advanced several public safety takeaways. Schools and mental health professionals emphasized the need for behavioral screening, particularly when children display social withdrawal, fixation on violence, or dialogue about death. Counselors recommended training staff to spot emotional distress and escalate support. Law enforcement agencies revised crisis response guidelines to include swift mental health referral options, not just active shooter protocols, and family education on warning signs. The case became a cautionary example in discussions around early psychosis prevention, juvenile justice reform, and the integration of legal proceedings with therapeutic intervention. By examining this tragedy, viewers must consider fundamental questions. How far does personal responsibility extend when the offender is deeply disturbed? Can a teenager like Zachary ever truly reintegrate into society? His case reinforces that even horrific crimes stem from layers of psychological and environmental breakdown, and that detection and prevention often start long before any weapon is lifted. Case 6, T.J. Lane. On the morning of February 27, 2012, the usual buzz of nervous energy filled Chardon High School's cafeteria in suburban Ohio as students waited for their bus to the vocational center. At precisely 7:30 a.m., Thomas T.J. Lane stepped into the cafeteria carrying a .22 caliber Ruger pistol he had taken from his uncle's house. Witnesses later described him raising the weapon and firing 10 times, apparently at random, killing 3 classmates and wounding 3 others. He then fled the scene, was captured near his car moments later, and within days was charged as an adult with aggravated murder, attempted murder, and assault. The investigation would soon reveal a chilling portrait of a teenager who appeared calm, composed, and disturbingly detached from the horror he caused. Lane was 17 at the time, a sophomore attending an alternative education program called Lake Academy, reserved for students referred due to academic or behavioral challenges. Friends described him as quiet and reserved, though not violent. Some peers claimed he had been bullied, but others disputed this. The community was left grappling with a portrait of a young man who seemed to collapse reality into chaos without any apparent motive. Investigators pieced together the crime scene with help from surveillance footage, forensic evidence, and witness interviews. Lane had aimed at a table where one of his victims, Demetrius Hewlin, sat, suggesting a personal connection. According to classmates, Lane had previously been threatened by Hewlin and had begun weightlifting and preparing to confront him physically. That morning, Lane shot 3 boys seated at that table, 16 and 17-year-olds, and injured others, one of whom later became permanently paralyzed. He then shot at another student while fleeing the school before being apprehended minutes later. Authorities confirmed Lane fired around 10 shots, demonstrating a level of premeditation rather than random impulse. Ahead of legal proceedings, a juvenile court judge evaluated Lane's mental state. Despite claims in court psychologist evaluations that he suffered from hallucinations and psychosis, the judge ruled Lane competent to stand trial, confirming he understood the charges, the courtroom process, and could assist in his own defense. Lane did not present an insanity defense, and his competency clearance paved the way for him to be charged as an adult. The psychological profile that emerged was complex. Prosecutors argued that Lane harbored repressed resentment, had suffered a fractured and unstable home environment, and displayed calculated intent. Defense accounts painted a quieter image, a teenager displaced by family turmoil, who drifted through school with minimal support. The court found the prosecution's argument more persuasive, that Lane acted with awareness and intent, choosing his victims and bringing both a gun and a knife to the cafeteria. At his sentencing hearing in March 2013, Lane delivered a chilling exclamation of defiance. Under a blue dress shirt, he revealed a white t-shirt with "Killer" scrawled across the front, mirroring the shirt he had reportedly worn on the day of the shooting. He smiled and laughed as grieving families delivered emotionally charged victim impact statements. After being handed 3 consecutive life sentences without parole, Lane turned toward the families and gave them the middle finger while taunting them with graphic remarks. The judge declared that Lane had shown total disrespect for the lives he ended and the community he shattered. The legal proceedings closed with no possibility of release for Lane. Ohio law barred parole in his case, meaning he will remain incarcerated for life. A wrongful death lawsuit followed, targeting the school district and Lane's family. Families of the victims were awarded millions in settlements amid intense debate over institutional accountability. Meanwhile, Lane became a symbol in juvenile criminal justice debates about whether teenage offenders can truly change or deserve rehabilitation. Beyond the courtroom drama, the Chardon shooting illuminated gaps in school violence prevention. Local officials quickly enacted improved security protocols, trauma counseling services, and student reunions designed to help the community heal. The Chardon Healing Fund raised funds, and students organized solidarity events, including wearing red to school in tribute to the victims. Mental health professionals emphasized early detection of behavioral warning signals, peer intervention programs, and clearer paths for student support, long before tragedy strikes. Psychologically, Lane's behavior defies simple explanations. He moved deliberately through the cafeteria, fired on classmates he knew, and with chilling indifference faced his own sentencing hearing. He described no remorse during the plea, refused mitigation by instructing his attorney not to make any case on his behalf, and appeared emotionally disconnected, even glib, when confronted by survivors' families. This suggested a level of cognitive detachment that challenged conventional ideas about adolescent impulse behavior. Lessons from this case emphasize the roles that early childhood trauma, behavioral isolation, and institutional oversight can play in evolving youth violence. The public safety takeaways were as urgent as they were uncomfortable. Improved school resource officer training, strict prohibition of weapons on campus, behavioral intervention teams, and community awareness around at-risk youth, even those who seem outwardly normal. In reflecting on the case today, justice experts and mental health advocates continue to weigh rehabilitation against accountability. Lane remains in prison, and his case figures in ongoing dialogues about juvenile sentencing reform, especially for those who exhibit psychosis or trauma histories. While some push for rehabilitation and eventual reintegration, others point to the chilling lack of empathy Lane displayed before and after the attacks. The story of TJ Lane is not just a school shooting. It's a deeply unsettling examination of motive, instability, and cultural failure. It forces reflection on how a seemingly polite teenager can become a calculated threat, how a school can misread loneliness as compliance, and how legal systems must grapple with cases that remain psychologically unfathomable. Despite the passage of years, the emotional weight of Chardon outlasts headlines. The victims' families, the injured survivors, and the broader community will forever carry the legacy of a morning that began like any other and ended in senseless tragedy. This narrative underscores the intersection of criminal justice, psychological crisis, and public safety reform. It's a case study in how danger can walk in plain sight, and in why understanding the mind behind violence is as critical as any security measure. Case 7. Joshua Young. On a spring morning in Louisville, Kentucky, a tragedy unfolded that would reveal more than pain. It would expose how fragile blended family loyalty and adolescent psychology can be. In May 2011, the body of 14-year-old Trey Zwicker was found beaten and left behind Liberty High School. His stepbrother, 15-year-old Josh Young, was arrested and ultimately charged as an adult in a case that mesmerized the nation with its tangled motives and courtroom drama. Josh Young seemed to live a typical teen life. He stood accused of helping his father, later identified as Joshua Gooker, physically overpower Trey inside the family home before disposing of both weapon and clothing. Recovered police records and arrest affidavits described how Josh allegedly beat his stepbrother and then attempted to eliminate evidence by throwing items into water near the high school. Prosecutors argued that his involvement went beyond passive complicity. They painted a disturbing portrait of a boy caught in loyalty to a domineering father. Yet in court, the defense told a very different narrative. They pressed that Josh was manipulated, effectively overshadowed by his father's force and influence. His mental state, birth order anxieties, and a fraught family dynamic all surfaced in the psychological profile presented during the trial. No physical forensic evidence linked him to the scene, and the testimony of witnesses was heavily scrutinized, especially since Gooker himself had initially attempted to shift blame onto his son, then later confessed to acting alone. When the jury deliberated for 9 hours in August 2013, they returned a verdict that stunned many. Josh Young was acquitted of murder and tampering charges. The verdict hinged on reasonable doubt. The testimony of his father was inconsistent, forensic findings were inconclusive, and the prosecution failed to secure solid proof of Josh's direct participation. The courtroom tension was palpable. Trey's grieving family wore visible anguish, while Josh left with relief and emotional embraces from his defense team and supporters. Despite the not guilty verdict, public debate intensified. Trey's father issued a statement expressing that the justice system had failed his son. He insisted Josh had been involved and condemned the outcome. Meanwhile, Josh's defense attorney described him as a scapegoat for a father who sought to protect himself. The trial testimony raised key questions about personal accountability, paternal control, and whether a teenager can be culpable or coerced by a dominant parent figure. In the years following the trial, Joshua Young wrote a letter from prison admitting that he alone had killed Trey, a confession that shocked anyone who believed the jury's verdict. He claimed his father had lied on the stand and that no one else was involved. The letter offered no remorse and seemed calculated, leaving investigators and legal experts questioning his initial acquittal. Young's post-acquittal life was turbulent. He was arrested multiple times for drug offenses, weapon charges, and other violent incidents. Federal charges later resulted in a conviction for firearm possession, carrying a sentence of over 5 years with no parole option. That outcome, rendered by a plea deal, served as a stark example of how legal consequences can catch up even after major vindication in high-profile trials. The case highlighted significant legal and social debates. Should a teen so young be tried as an adult in violent cases? Kentucky law allows it, but critics question the fairness of trying a minor under adult legal standards. The trial spotlighted the complexity of father-son dynamics, coercion versus free will, and how easy it is to misinterpret subtle psychological manipulation as consent. Counter-arguments centered on the need for parental accountability, especially given that Gooker had eventually pleaded guilty and absorbed the legal consequence for Trey's death. Lessons from this tragedy remain deeply cautionary. Law enforcement training was adjusted to include more scrutiny when investigators interview families with layered relationships. Prosecutors were urged to rely not just on confessions or emotional testimony, but secure forensic corroboration that isolates physical involvement. Schools and social services revisited how blended families are monitored for tension, how teen conflict is detected, and how signs of coercive behavior can be better recognized. The psychological profile revealed a teenager trapped between loyalty and silence, accused of violence that prosecutors couldn't conclusively tie to him. The justice system was forced to grapple with whether acquittal meant innocence or was simply a lack of proof. The emotional echoes continued through every sentence in legal appeals, discussion panels on juvenile culpability, and in academic analyses comparing youth submission and independent intentionality. As time moved on, Joshua Young's series of legal troubles emphasized that acquittal does not close a narrative. His later arrests for trafficking controlled substances, and a federal gun conviction became part of an ongoing story about accountability and the limits of redemption. Meanwhile, Trey Zwicker's family continued to search for closure, haunted by unanswered questions about motive and manipulation. The narrative of Joshua Young is not about violence alone, but about trust broken, psychological control exerted by an authority figure, and a teenager whose silence spoke louder than words in court. It challenges the criminal justice system to ask, when is a teen responsible, and when is he a victim of someone else's intent? The lessons linger, not just about punishment, but about prevention, family dynamics, mental health, and the delicate boundary between complicity and coercion. Case 8. Alex Carin. On the chilly morning of December 9, 2010, in Golden Gate Estates, Florida, a serene suburban street became the scene of an unthinkable act. Inside the home of Thomas and Kelly Carin, their 14-year-old son, Alex Carin, retrieved a rifle from the closet and shot his parents while they slept. Detectives arrived around 8:40 a.m. to find them deceased in their master bathroom. Alex calmly surrendered, called 911, and claimed that he had no memory of the incident, saying he was sleeping, and the next thing I knew I had a gun in my hand. Neighbors and classmates described Alex as smart, popular, and polite. A teenager who dated, joked, and excelled in school. No one saw violence or emotional turmoil simmering beneath the surface. His grandmother stood behind him, asserting that the crime was beyond his control and suggesting a medical or psychological episode as the cause. Law enforcement launched a thorough investigation, recovering the rifle on the bathroom floor along with shell casings. Witness testimony revealed that the Carins had once considered selling the family's only gun, kept loaded in a closet, yet had decided against it. This detail became pivotal in court discussions about firearm access and parental responsibility. Alex was initially charged with second-degree murder, sparking debate over whether he should be tried as a juvenile or an adult. 3 psychiatric evaluations were conducted, exploring his mental state and maturity. Prosecutors ultimately charged him as an adult with manslaughter, seeking a sentence under Florida's 10-20 life law, which mandates severe punishment even for juveniles. At the legal proceedings, Alex pleaded no contest to 2 counts of manslaughter with a firearm. Courtroom testimony painted a troubled emotional landscape. He had expressed resentment toward his parents over their disciplined rules, groundings, loss of cell phone and computer privileges, and reportedly said he was fed up with being bossed around. Despite this, prosecutors emphasized premeditation. Alex had obtained the most serious weapon in the home and carried out the act with disturbing composure. During the sentencing hearing, Judge Lauren Brody imposed a 20-year sentence. While below the maximum life term a murder conviction would carry, it guaranteed Alex would remain incarcerated until at least age 30. Though because he was housed in a juvenile facility, he may transition to adult custody later. Despite his youth, court officials concluded that the nature of the crime and lack of compelling evidence of psychosis precluded leniency. This case triggered broader discussion on juvenile justice and the concept of rehabilitation versus punishment. Florida became notorious for treating underage offenders like adults, and Alex's case became emblematic, raising urgent questions. Should 14-year-olds face adult sentencing? How does impulse control develop in adolescence? And can psychological screening prevent tragedies in homes where guns are accessible? Within Collier County, schools introduced enhanced monitoring of behavioral changes in students, improved reporting protocols for emotional distress, and increased collaboration with mental health professionals, a shift aimed at intervention rather than hindsight. Psychological analysts cited Alex's developmental immaturity, susceptibility to emotional upset, and impulsivity as risk factors. Experts observed that at 14, the brain's frontal lobe, responsible for impulse control and moral decision-making, is still under development. Combined with feelings of entrapment and restricted autonomy, Alex's emotional state may have reached a breaking point. Yet courts concluded that he still understood wrongdoing, undermining defense arguments of dissociation or temporary insanity. The criminal justice system faced scrutiny for charging a minor as an adult and for refusing to consider juvenile treatment programs. Alex's plea deal bypassed typical juvenile rehabilitation options. When asked years later if he felt remorse, Alex reportedly offered only vague statements, further chilling courtroom observers. Jurists and psychologists continue to debate whether adequate emphasis was placed on mental health assessment and whether Florida's rigid sentencing models served justice or neglected nuance. Lessons from this tragedy are sobering. Families must secure firearms properly and consider mental health screening when conflicts escalate. Schools and communities should pay attention not only to overt aggression, but to subtle resentment, nonstop defiance, or emotional withdrawal, especially in teens living under strict household rules. Behavioral counseling and conflict resolution tools in homes and schools can build trust before discipline breeds resentment. Alex Crane's story did not end with sentencing. Public defenders and juvenile advocates highlighted cases like his when opposing legislative proposals banning parole for juveniles. The argument centered on developmental neuroscience and the potential for transformation, even in those who commit severe crimes in youth. Still, in Alex's case, the sentence left scant room for early release or leniency. This narrative goes beyond headline shock. It rests on psychological tension between adolescent rebellion, parental authority, and gun access. It questions whether restrictions imposed by well-meaning parents might inadvertently contribute to emotional escalation, and whether our institutions are equipped to handle minors in crisis. The courtroom drama, the sentencing hearing, the arguments about intent versus impulse, all serve as cautionary tales and legal lessons. Ultimately, the Crane case remains a powerful study in juvenile violence and criminal justice. A promising young life unraveled in minutes, leaving a community grieving and a legal system compelled to weigh public safety against the possibility of juvenile transformation. The story forces reflection on gun safety, mental health awareness, and the fine line between discipline and control. And whether, somewhere in between, tragedy might have been diverted rather than endured. If these stories made you think twice, if they gripped you, shocked you, or left you craving to know what lies beneath the surface, hit that subscribe button now and join the Mindframe True Crimes family. Every week, we dive deeper into the hidden corridors of the human mind, unraveling the truths behind the headlines and the secrets even courtrooms can't fully reveal. And to all my loyal subscribers and returning viewers, thank you for keeping your mind in the frame. You're the reason we can keep shining a light into the world's darkest corners. Stay safe, stay vigilant, and remember, the mind is the most dangerous place of all. This is Mindframe True Crimes. Until next time.